Hello and welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive World's Handbook. Today I'm in Oakland, California, taking you through the very interesting, intriguing, and indeed conceptual Museum of Capitalism. If you've looked at this particular museum, if you had a chance to visit it, or if you read about it in the news, it's a temporary museum located in Jack London Square, and I'll talk about its location later. As of this recording, it's scheduled to close on August 20th of 2017. We'll have to see if it reemerges somewhere else. I know there are plans to try to keep this museum going. Its many collections, its interesting artworks, and I know there's been so much community interest in this particular museum for its uniqueness. It's the creation of fictilists, two individuals, and you can read more about how the museum came to be online. There was a pretty massive grant involved of over $250,000, and also support from the Austrian consulate in the United States. And I think for me what's interesting about this museum is how it does approach the ideas within it from an incredibly conceptual sense. So by conceptual we mean we're trying to get the guest to think about something beyond the exhibits, the objects themselves. And indeed, in some ways, I would say the Museum of Capitalism reminds me of two other great conceptual spaces. The first being Dennis Seaver's house in Spitalfields section of London, and the second, the Museum of Jurassic Technology, located across the world in Culver City, California. And what all of these spaces have in common is this approach to getting us to think, as I said earlier, beyond the space itself. And I would suggest to you, as we look at these pharmaceutical pens given to doctors who are involved in the medical industries, or given by reps to doctors in the medical industry, as we look at these, we're reminded maybe of something different being approached here in terms of the concept of the museum. The location of the museum itself, I would offer to you, is somewhat of a meta commentary. And as I take you through some of the spaces of the museum today, I'll try to focus on the art. I'll try to talk about my interpretations of what I experienced. You should certainly see the museum on your own and experience it yourself. It's in a rather interesting location. You see here walking up the steps. We're just at Jack London Square. And you'll see here this image of the Heinolds First and Last Chance Saloon. And then just above that is this massive office building. And it's such an interesting location, and I think it does provide its own meta commentary through the space itself. Because of the history, as I'll talk about later, of this particular space, it was the hopes to develop this section of Oakland with many businesses, including a large food hall that was planned for this location on the first floor. And you'll see that in a little bit as we see some shots looking down at the space itself just below the Museum of Capitalism, which is located on the second floor. Now this is a listing of the hours. Again, probably going to be closed by the time that you see this video, but I hope there'll be some sort of support to keep this museum alive, because I think it is so important in many ways. This shows you the location at 55 Harrison Street. And this is one of those rare cases where I thought I would actually detail to you how to get to the museum in case you plan to visit. And it again relates to my story of visiting. If you go, you have to park in that garage there. And what happened to me was when I put 55 Harrison into my GPS, I kept going through the tunnel below the water, back and forth. And there was a funny moment actually where I was right below, I guess, the museum perhaps, or near it, and my GPS said while I was in the tunnel that I was arriving at the Museum of Capitalism, because I'd put that location into my GPS. So if you go, you actually have to park in the parking garage, and then you have to walk across the street basically above the Amtrak rail station tracks. And I had a hard time even finding my way into the building. If you walk across that walkway across the tracks, you can enter near the gift shop on the actual second floor. If you go all the way down to where Heinolds is, the saloon, you actually will be at ground level, and then you'll walk the stairs up and go through the front entrance. And it's kind of interesting, again, when you go in the entrance and you see the remnants of this food hall. And if you poke around on the internet, you can look at some of the efforts that have been made in the past, unsuccessful efforts, to develop this section of Oakland. And we're seeing here again the entrance up at the front in the Museum of Capitalism. I have to say it's a very strange space just in terms of where the museum is located, relative to what topics are being considered. And this is why I think it's important to say that indeed this museum is making, I think, a meta-commentary just through its location and part of its tract that is considering capitalism, the sort of the three periods, the past, present, and future. The future side of things gets us to imagine that capitalism has eroded, has collapsed, and thus there are remnants of it. You'll see later the faded Safeway bags, some of the other abandoned signs, a really interesting project there. And as we're looking at here, you see this is inside the museum, an image of Jack London Square, actually a diorama. And so again, another bit of meta commentary. We're looking at the entrance here. I went on, I'm trying to remember the day of the week I went. It was a weekday, and I was one of the first guests to enter. It's totally free to go in, and so that's one of the great things about the support that they've had through the museum. I see a shot here of the harbor and the interesting penny machine here, which is one of many artistic commentaries. One of the reasons I think the museum works is conceptually it's getting us to think, to do things, to ponder, to have an existential effect on us as we think about some of these issues. We're looking at some of the remnants here, the flags of capitalist banks that have gone under. This is produced by a Danish art collective. Looking here now down at that space I'm talking about. So this was plans to have a food hall, and during my tour, I actually asked one of the docents, I said, what's with all the quotes down there? And the woman had said, she wasn't really sure, and that when they occupied the space, everything was already there. And so this stuff was, just there from this previous attempt to develop this 55 Harrison building. The other thing is if you go in the building, you'll actually see, to get up to the upper floors where there are offices, there's actually a guard station there. I had an interesting conversation with the guard just about where the museum was and how to get in there, and that was kind of part of my experience of this. As I'm looking at this abandoned space below, I actually had this thought, and this will be maybe one of my critiques I'll talk about in my tour today, is that they could develop, if they had access to the bottom floor space, they could almost develop a immersive walkthrough space. You could imagine a curious space in which you would, as a guest, walk through, say, a typical consumer house, capitalist house that has eroded or been repurposed or changed through bricolage or some other techniques as the capitalist system has collapsed, looking at this projection into the future. You could also imagine there could be cityscapes that you could walk in that would purport to look at how the future of capitalism might be. So I just had this vision as I was walking through the space. I thought that would be kind of cool. And because I study themed and immersive spaces, I'm always thinking about how can, not just a museum, but any theme space, including theme parks, how can it envelop the guest within its space? And for me, maybe that was one thing that could have been done at a higher level, was just to have something more immersive being developed. And one way I thought of possibly accomplishing this would be some sort of walk-through space. Now, there are certainly spaces you'll see. There's a treadmill that you'll take a look at later. There's a police meditation chamber. There are immersive qualities to this museum. But I would say on many levels, it does maintain itself within that traditional museal space in which people experience objects, and to some extent spaces or quasi-spaces. I'm not saying you can't be immersed or existentially consider significant issues in the conceptual sense that I'm talking about today, that I think they do get the guests to think about or ruminate on, but I'm suggesting that the immersiveness of the museum, I think, in some ways, maybe it could have been increased or changed or altered in some sense. So let me also suggest that I think one of the ways that the Museum of Capitalism is successful is in the sense that it gets us to think in a meta context. That is beyond the exhibits or representations or symbols themselves. Actually reminds me of a funny thing that happened if you Google glasses mistaken for work of art. There were some famous shots on Instagram and all over social media of some visitors to a museum who accidentally thought that some glasses that someone left on the floor were a work of art. And this is a humorous example, I think, of how in contemporary museums sometimes we're not exactly sure what we're seeing or what we should be seeing. Not as if, a curator is ever totally defining the museum for us. This actually happened to me. So I was looking at the exhibit on lights, which we'll get to in a second, the light that elongated the day, and I noticed a area for brochures here, a folder, and there are some other brochures you'll see later that the museum offers to guests, to visitors, and in this case they were missing. So I asked one of the docents, and I said, is this a point or something? Is this a meta commentary that, there isn't information to go along with this, as if suggesting something about invisible consumption or externalities of, say, lighting and the like? And she laughed and said, no, we're just out of the brochures. That does happen time to time when you visit these sorts of spaces. Now, the other space that I should have mentioned earlier that I think is similar in goals, perhaps a much different scale, more immersive, is Banksy's Dismal Land, which was located in a rural part of England for, also a pop-up like the Museum of Capitalism. I was interviewed for a story about it in the Independent that Christopher Beanland did, and it's another, I think, interesting example to use context of capitalism, or in this case, more consumer society, and the theme park, and Disney, of course, to get us to critically think about the world, to get us to see the world in some new senses. When I did this article interview for the Independent, I suggested that, the quote here, often theme parks are places of pleasure, and we don't think about pain and the dark sides of human existence and existential issues. And so what I suggest in this article is that spaces like Dismal Land are conceptual spaces, but perhaps they're a sense of the space of the future. The other interesting side of the Museum of Capitalism today is that in consumer society, we see more and more examples of irony, examples of trying to get consumers to think about disturbing issues. Heineken just did an interesting video you can check out on YouTube of trying to get people from different political spectrums to talk together, about political issues over a beer. Very controversial, as you might imagine, and it's reminiscent of Kylie Jenner's, failed attempt with the Pepsi commercial that went viral for all the wrong reasons. So here is that exhibit, the light that elongated the day, and you can look at some of the texture. I won't read the whole thing to you. There is a lot of textual content that you will encounter when you go to the Museum of Capitalism. So again, I think there's an effort here to teach us something, to get us to think about something beyond this museum space itself. And I think having this meta exhibit about the lights gets us to think about things we don't think about in a capitalist society. Capitalism is always about creative destruction, as many people have talked about. So this issue of the art and the everyday, I think, is very important in terms of trying to imagine how you can get visitors to change their approach to living vis-a-vis this critique of capitalism. And in that sense, I would say there's definitely a pedagogical project going on in this museum. if you're dealing with a concept museum or a conceptual space of any sort, it is going to fall on the artists and the curators to create a space that tries to do something more than just entertain or even inform the guest. Again, I would suggest the emphasis here is on changing the guest in some deep and profound senses. This is the Fictalist, their statement of purpose, if you will. If you want to read this, I guess you could just pause the video. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But it's interesting seeing one of the texts here in that middle paragraph, coming to terms with capitalism. Museums seem capable of providing some of that space and distance, but museums have been and still remain a no less fraught phenomenon. It's interesting, and then they talk about how the museum may be a puzzling space in which to talk about capitalism. But I think it's an appropriate space. I think not unlike what Banksy did at Dismal Land, they're using individual artists, drawing them together, curating them, and then having that effect on the guest, I think, by showing you different voices that represent some side of this mystery, if you will, of capitalism that obviously needs to be solved if we want to save the planet and perhaps save our lives. Here's another conceptual meta thing. It's Evan Desmond's Shop of Desires. And as I was looking at this is right in front of the gift shop. I kept thinking to myself that, this is a space they're going to develop, they're going to fill with more consumer goods. Well, that's the whole point of it, right? It's an empty gift shop. It says something about the abandonment of capitalism. And actually, if you look at the artist's name here outside the official gift shop, you can actually see then that he's credited for both of these. The Shop of Desires, the empty gift shop, and then the, if you will, actual gift shop, which we will actually look at a little bit later at the end of this video. Now, another everyday meta space is what they call the capitalist bathroom experience. So the idea behind this is that you go into the bathroom and they have this brochure, as you're seeing here, that you can look at, which is certainly an interesting history of the bathroom and its many oppressive sides, from surveillance to segregation of people. I mean, think today about transgender bathrooms. But now, as I walked inside the bathroom, I guess I was looking for more visual cues or something experiential to happen in the restroom. And not unlike a lot of restrooms, say in theme parks, the theming ends right at the door. Not always the case. I mean, some casinos and theme parks have themed restrooms. So this was one area where I was hoping for something more experiential to happen in the restroom. Essentially, from what I got out of it, you had to read this brochure, and then that brochure detailed, as you can see on the sign here, some of the capitalist connections with the restroom. So wasn't immersive in the sense that I thought it could have been, I guess, existentially. But I'll try to draw out in this video today the good sides of the museum and sides where I thought there was maybe room for improvement. This is a map of the museum. It's relatively small, but you will spend hours in this space because of just the existential effect, I think, of looking at what you're looking at. This shows you the brochure that you receive when you go to the museum. It's a very deep perspective. I think it's one of those where you'll be thinking about things maybe more so after you leave the space. I certainly did. Than while you're in this space. From a purely immersive standpoint, I found that while I was visiting the space, I was flooded with a lot of ideas, and I couldn't really break things down. I actually visited the museum. Drove to Oakland, stayed a couple nights just for the purpose of going here. So it was kind of a big deal for me to go before its closure. So I think it would have been better if I could have done it over a period of 2 days, taken a break, had a cup of coffee, come back, and perhaps thought about things, because it is very deep, and it's something that will challenge most visitors, I think. Not just in terms of maybe, we all lack certain bits of information. Maybe we need to understand something. I mean, historically, I found that I didn't get everything in the museum, if you will. I mean, I've read a lot of Marxist theory in graduate school, but even that wasn't enough maybe to prepare me for some of what I was seeing while visiting the spaces of the Museum of Capitalism. So I'd offer to you that one of the curious issues that's played with at the museum in terms of the conceptual approach is a play with time. In a sense, you get this conflation of past, present, and future. So you'll find quite a few exhibits, including this one here, focused on MLK and the civil rights movement, that have a historical or past-centered focus, which is, I think, very significant for stressing context for the future in terms of offering opportunities for guests to think about activism and agency and how the past is prologue in some important senses to get us to think about the future. The future, of course, is referenced in these hypothetical senses, and I've talked about in this video. You have the past tense for descriptions of many of the objects in the museum. You have, even focused on the police, there's a discussion of the past tense. So the assumption is that visitors can imagine a future in which capitalism is no longer present, or it occurs in a much different form. And then the present, you could say, is also visible. Of course, at any given moment as you're walking through the museum, you're experiencing a sense of the present. And perhaps one way of envisioning that is to say, as you're looking out here at Jack London Square, and you're also looking at this exhibit that focuses on the past, this diorama, you have an opportunity to, as Heidegger would talk about, fuse the different temporalities together. And I think that's an important, maybe opportunity to look at what's so unique about this museum in terms of how it offers us something that temporally is somewhat shaky or unclear, and I think it's a strength of the aesthetic approach at this museum. You can look at other examples of contexts in museums, certainly where this is done, but I think it's done very effectively here at the Museum of Capitalism, and as such, it maybe leaves you, as you walk away from the museum days later, you might think actually about more of these contexts because of that ambiguity of time that is present throughout your journey through the various spaces of the Museum of Capitalism. So as we continue to talk about time, I thought it'd be important to bring in the concept of the ruin. And again, there's a conflation of past, present, and future at the Museum of Capitalism. And one of the curious things, I think, is how the ruins of capitalism, the after effects, the legacies are felt in the various exhibits. For example, Jordan Bennett's artifact bags. You have these faded, really well done 99-cent store bags. You'll see examples of a Walmart as well, and Safeway. And to me, this is an indication, I think, of what is going on conceptually at the Museum of Capitalism, as you see some more shots of them here. It's fascinating as an art project. If you think about this aesthetically, they've, taken these ruins of capitalism and consumer society and put them on pedestals, right? So, it's a very effective, I think, use of the aesthetic medium. You just see quite wonderful, I think. These are what greet you when you come in as a guest. So for me, this was one of the most striking things about the museum. You see other examples of ruins here coming up. The corrugated material here, which is from a cargo ship. So, things like this, again, really establish, and this is, by the way, Gabby Miller's Logistics from Sea to Land, and there's a cardboard box to the right of it. Now, here's an interesting thing about some of the language, right? It's the use of the past tense. The shipping container was designed to be transported. You see another example of that here at the bottom. These containers touched all of our lives. And so this is the use of the past tense. And I think this makes it very curious when you think about this temporal project that is going on here at the Museum of Capitalism. Here's another great piece, Tim Portlock's Cash for Gold. These are computer-generated images that are based on real places, and this real place happens to be San Bernardino. So for me, there was something quite fascinating in this particular image in terms of how striking it is. It's saying something about simulation. It's saying certainly something about the time in which many people in the United States felt the negative effects of capitalism, and we're talking about the housing crisis and the all the predatory banks that gave so many loans to people and led to the housing bubble in the late 2000s and so forth. So really, I think, striking in terms of thinking about this here at the Museum of Capitalism. We see some further ruins actually in the gift shop. These are artifacts collected from Jack London Square that you could purchase if you wanted. It's another indication of what's left over. We talked about this earlier, but the performative gift shop here, the conceptual gift shop that's empty, suggests inhabitation and then a lack of habitation in terms of nothing being left in the gift shop. It's sort of decayed. The coal hat here, if you remember the Trump campaign in 2016-2017, a lot of discussion of coal and Trump, quote, digging coal. This is another example here where they're talking about in the past tense. The hat used to be worn, and hats like these used to be worn by people in a former capitalistic society. And here's another piece that has a temporal play of sorts called tarp. And the plaque describes this as a typical tarp that would be used in a homeless shelter or homeless living center, such as in Oakland, where there are significant homeless populations. I read a review in Art in America, and they actually were critical. This particular piece, and maybe the conflation of time that we're talking about here, they suggested that by putting this in the past tense, by using was, might suggest to people that it's still not a part of our reality and that there isn't anything to be done in terms of homelessness. I actually don't agree with that critique because I think the way they're playing with time here and using the past tense and focusing on what I'm calling these runes of capitalism, they are in fact, I think, calling attention to the idea of change and transformation. And all Marxist discourse, practically, right, has some notion of revolutionary potential within the proletariat, within the working class, eventually overthrowing the capitalists. So I actually don't agree with that particular critique that was offered. And the next series of photographs, including the old money store pyramid in Sacramento, which I found fascinating to see that image. These are, again, ruins of capitalism, but they have a more contemporary feel to them, not just because of the architecture, but because of just the time involved. Some of them are quite recent. Now we're getting into, you see here, what's called the Abandoned Signs project by the collective Temporary Services. This one I thought was really fascinating. It's laid out for you here in this rather minimalistic visual style, and the basic idea behind this is they've collected images from around the country of abandoned buildings, of signs that have decayed, the visages of what used to be in terms of a lot of capitalist places. You can tell by looking at the booklet that comes along with the exhibit, I'll show you that in a second, that some of these were big box stores, others were rather small places, and who knows, maybe mom and pop diners and so forth. So this particular project, and there were quite a few like this, where they had information that the guest, the visitor, could take with him or her, and I thought this was effective. It establishes a sort of post connection with the guest where they can continue to think about some of these issues after the fact. And I should say that many of the art collectives or artists portrayed or whose work is exhibited at the Museum of Capitalism are doing classes on many of the very topics. And for me, this is key. This is part of that pedagogy of the museum I was talking about earlier. It's extending the conversation, it's creating dialogue, it's creating opportunities for growth and learning and potentially transformation and activism. So this, I think, distinguishes this museum from some other museums in the fact that there is so much emphasis on pedagogy, on these public lectures, on bringing the artists in and having conversations with individuals from the community, whomever wants to come, and to really think about these issues in a much deeper sense. So again, for me, this Abandoned Signs project was one of the more fascinating projects at the museum. I have to say that one of the things that makes the museum so interesting, in my mind, is its play with symbols. It reminds me of the work of anthropologist Victor Turner, who so many years ago said quite profoundly that symbols instigate social action. You can certainly apply this context to art, and I would say you could apply it to so many of the examples that we see here at the museum. One instance here, Igor Vamos coin crusher. So here we're using symbols, And of course, all museums use symbols, but if you look at this particular use of symbolic language, you're taking something that is typical. It has a context in, say, amusement parks, in theme parks, in all sorts of places of consumer society. You can see the difference here is that when you use it, it puts something much different on the coin. I didn't get a chance to try this during my visit, but it would stamp one of these four phrases here that are supposed to be reminders of capitalism. So there's a literalness here. You're playing with the symbol of the innocence of the souvenir coin machine, and you're doing something quite different because A, you've located the meaning within the museum, and B, you've established different messages on the coins themselves. Here's another example of using symbols, a lot focused on different types of currency. There was even one exhibit, I don't think I have an image of it, unfortunately, but one artist envisioned creating a new currency out of simple mud, and so that would be interesting, to take a look at. Here's the second of the penny exhibits, and this particular one was trying to get the guests to envision something about minimum wage. Here is the plaque here, which you can read. It talks a little bit that if you turn the crank and got 1 penny every 3.5 seconds, you would, it'd take you a while to get the minimum wage. And so it's trying to get the guests to realize that there is a local context to this, to understand that a lot of people live in terrible conditions of socioeconomic inequality, and thus they're trying to get us to reflect on this. Here are some more symbols. So these are wands, a collection of various wands. Some of these have, all sorts of different contexts you could think about there of consumer society and its different aspects. We talked earlier, all the symbols of the banks represented here, so those are very powerful as well for the guest. Here's Mark Curran's piece, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, but the symbolism here is quite strong. You have the boardroom, you have the interviews on the table, and then to the left of that, you have these papers 6 feet high represent one trade, basically, in 1 second across the world. As you can see here, it says that the stack of paper represents the amount of positions taken on one stock in 1 second globally in 1 year in 2011. Pretty amazing. Future farmers piece here, for want of a nail. There's a lot past the criminal justice section of the museum that has ecological context. Here's another FDIC insured, and this is focused on books that are burned. There's also, I would say, symbolism here to the books present in the library. They do have a role, certainly, as books in the library, but they also have, I think, another symbolic purpose to them that you could certainly talk about and consider. Now, the next piece to look at here also has powerful symbolism. This is called People Powered, and this one is a representation of the language of protest, going back in time. Again, a conflation of different time periods. The artist took most of these words from protest signs, protests that took place in the Bay Area. And you see some of the words here, and you get a sense of the powerful symbolism. Words like imagine and peace and victory, just important words in terms of thinking about. You see some additional ones here: stop, abuse, fight, hatred, freedom now, stand up. So this is important symbolically because you're taking, on the one hand, words and you're transforming them. You're turning them into these stencils, and I think their appearance in the museum in this symbolic form as stencils is quite powerful, because what it suggests to us is that as a symbol, as a metaphor, you can imagine people repeating. And it's not to say that literally they'll take these stencils and put them on signs and recreate, previous phrases, but the idea is that there's a constant struggle, and these words are reminders, and thus the stencil suggests to us that there's a replication to it. You can formulate new protests, and in some cases you're still dealing with the same issues, even though you've been fighting these issues for so many years. And so this was, I think, just an incredibly powerful piece that greets the guest just as you enter the museum, just before you see the restrooms. And this is a plaque then that highlights, what we're just talking about, this idea that people have struggled and people need to continue to resist the systems of capitalism. And so I think it's a very important message at the museum, and I would say it's a somewhat subdued message, certainly compared to some other museum displays in other contexts. Now this one is quite powerful. This is called Finger Pointing Worker. And if you know about the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, you know why this is significant. But this is really stunning. You walk up to this, you can put on the headphones, there isn't a lot of audio. Basically what happened was one of the cleanup workers at the plant for a period of, I think it was 10 to 20 minutes, just stood and pointed at the camera, and I'll show you some video of that here, and just pointed at the camera for all this time. And I just found it to be incredibly, incredibly powerful as an art piece, and just also as, you know, an example of someone standing up and trying to hold government or corporations to be responsible for their actions that are going to have negative, incredibly negative ecological consequences. So a very powerful piece. Now, I mentioned the piece earlier, we'll talk about it now, Mark Curran. The table that you see here, it's called The Market, a piece that he's been working on. And so this, you have, you know, the symbolism of a boardroom table. And then you also have, we'll look at that in a second, the interview documents. I mentioned this earlier. This is the stack of trade documents. So you see over 6 feet tall. And this one actually, just that stack of papers is called The Normalization of Deviance 2. Trying to get us to think about, obviously with the title, right, the sense of deviance that is represented by the market. And as I talked about earlier, I think there's some incredible, powerful symbolism, as you see the plaque here that describes, we saw this earlier, but it's good to look at a second time, just all of that. If you imagine multiplying that stack of paper by all the positions in stock trading on a given day across the world, you couldn't even fill 55 Harrison Street with all of the paper. And that's another side of just how, two things, I think, the waste side of capitalism, and second is the invisibility, right? We could be asleep in our beds and not realize just all the things that have been done, sometimes in our name if we have stocks invested in particular companies, but we're not really following it. And so thus it's bringing a lot of this information to light. In some senses, this reminds me of an ethnographic project, because there's actually interview information, as you see here, available. You could sit down and read these. This particular one talks about an interview that was conducted in London at a cafe years ago, and here's some of the text that you can see related to that interview. So I think a very powerful piece that for me has quasi-ethnographic sensibilities to it. Okay, just next to the exhibit of the pharmaceutical pens, we have Stephen Cunningham's, it's actually untitled. You have 3 police batons, and I actually didn't discover this because I was filming and not maybe looking as closely as I could have been, but I discovered after my visit that these are all carved out to be flutes that can actually be played. And so I think in a sense you have a playing off of, taking something that has one symbolic original use, obviously to potentially hurt people, and then turning it into a musical instrument, which has a much different connotation. It reminds us again with symbolism that symbols can change. And I would offer that this section we're looking at now has a focus on policing and criminal justice primarily, and we'll look at a number of the exhibits that have this focus. But to go back to the flutes, obviously, if you're imagining a futuristic society in which batons are no longer necessary because maybe the police aren't necessary, sort of in a utopic sense, then the batons become flutes. You saw an example there of we'll come back to that one, the silhouettes. This is a police flag. It's a very interesting exhibit, artistic piece, and it's, I guess, often illuminated at night. They will sometimes have this, so if you're walking by Jack London Square at night, you can see this very powerful symbol shining brightly, I guess, through the windows. Now, another example here playing off symbols, obviously red, white, and blue, the American flag. It has the appearance of a flag, and then also it is symbolically, of course, representative of police. I loved actually in this piece, kind of apart from the symbolism, I just loved all those chords. I just thought that was a brilliant way of keeping them exposed and sort of cattywampus and haphazard. I just thought that was very cool. It's one of those things, sometimes you visit a museum, you see a piece, and there's something about it that you really are attracted to or taken with. And in my example of viewing it, I was really excited to see all those chords. Kind of strange, perhaps, but we all have a different perception when we visit a museum. But I think it's just a really powerful piece in terms of its construction, even on those shelves which you can buy in any sort of big box hardware store. This gives you a little bit of context about the lights, and it's the artist expressing what he intended in it, this piece. Here's another piece right next to it, and this is an example of, again, using the symbolism of criminal justice, actually taking police target silhouettes and then etching with a laser these various powerful phrases into them. So a very critical take on policing here at the Museum of Capitalism. And as we round out the tour here of the criminal justice focused exhibits, you see Packard Jennings' piece here, which is a meditation chamber, and it's a pretty interesting one, and I actually will share some of the audio of it that I did record while I went inside, and you can actually hear some of the text describing what the piece is focused on. Again, a very critical take on policing here at the museum in Oakland. But when you go inside, if you can't see this on the video, you can actually lie down and listen to the meditative sound, the ambient soundscape, and also the narrator talking on top of it. So this is a very interesting piece, and I think a fairly disturbing one. So let's have a listen here.
When you're ready, observe your body as a whole. Notice how it feels, present and calm. Feel a deep sense of relaxation wash over you. Recognize that any thoughts or emotions are fleeting and do not define you. Breathe in.
As we leave the meditation booth, we'll take a look at one last piece by the Center for Tactical Magic Universal Keys, or there on the left. It's the handcuff key. Powerful symbols, and this describes a little bit of what they were trying to accomplish with the piece. Again, I think a very critical take on our criminal justice system. One of the things I didn't realize is you could actually take one of these keys with you, and it suggests on this plaque here that symbolically then there's an implied freedom in this act, but is that really accurate? So I think throughout the museum, not unlike other critical museums like particularly Museum of Jurassic Technology, I believe the visitor leaves the Museum of Capitalism with a sense of doubt, with a sense of ambiguity about their own complicity in systems of power and domination. So it's a very interesting take, as you see here, ending this exhibit on criminal justice at the Museum of Capitalism. I wanted to mention there's also a special exhibition called the American Domain, and they had some concerns about photography and so forth, so I'm not including that, but it's a really great other side of what you'll experience at the Museum of Capitalism. Now, I wanted to express here, as we look at an image of the Tate Modern in London, that there is an interesting effective curation, I think, going on at this museum. And I had the image of the Tate there because I recall there was a powerful piece that was very critical of Thatcher's government and policies under the Thatcher administration. And I remember this piece had a, I don't have an image of it, but it was a machine that would be like a wood chipper, except plastic would go in and little silhouettes of people would come out. So what I want to suggest to you as we're looking at the alternatives societies, alternative economies room, which is very curious as well, I want to suggest to you this, that many museums, I think, deal with some of the topics that the Museum of Capitalism deal with, like this piece at the Tate Modern. But what is different here is you're putting them, quite obviously, all together in one space. So that sense of holism, that space of giving an identity, by interconnecting these pieces. The pieces, of course, have different subject matters. There's some similarity, but there's a sense of difference between every piece. But yet there's also this collective sensibility to what you experience as a guest when you take part in the museum, when you walk through it, when you look at any of the exhibits. So it's just something to remember, I think, about museums out there. I was going to say as well in closing on this discussion that if you were teaching a class in museum studies, it would be a wonderful opportunity to think critically about how to put together pieces and your overall vision and so forth. And also, I think it would be great for anyone interested in immersive spaces to visit a museum like this and think about their vision and what they accomplished, and also focus on some of your critiques as well. So food for thought for the future of critical museums like the Museum of Capitalism. And we just saw some video from this piece, so let's talk about it a little bit. This is Oliver Ressler's Alternative Economics, Alternative Societies. And for me, this quite clearly emphasizes the idea of the alternatives out there. If you have a museum of capitalism, it wouldn't make much sense if you didn't suggest to the guests that there are possibilities for different systems. And so, in a sense, this is your futuristic society vision. I mentioned something like this earlier in a more immersive sense, but what you get it is in more of a lecture form with a series of video interviews, and you could spend certainly a good part of maybe close to an hour listening to all the interviews, which are very interesting. This plaque gives you some sensibility about who is interviewed and what they're talking about and so forth. And I think, it's important to have something like this to give the guest a context of what is possible in terms of the future. Part of that information effort that they have, along with the pedagogy, the effort of having guest lectures and classes and different things for people to come in and experience beyond the actual exhibits themselves. I would say this, in a sense, reminded me the most of, say, like a World Expo tendency, where you would have a futuristic vision of society, but this, of course, a little more politicized, although some of what we saw, if you went to the Expo 2015 in Milan, I'm thinking of the Future Pavilion, Pavilion Zero, and it was absolutely as political as this in terms of talking about some of the ecological catastrophes on the horizon. So it reminds me of a World Expo format because of the fact that it's so much focused here on the information, on the interview context. And also they did this interesting graphic with some of the quotations related to these topics on the ground. So all in all, a very interesting side of focusing on the guest's ability to imagine alternatives beyond capitalism. Up here, you can see there was one interactive piece that reminded me really of serious gaming, focusing on ecological issues, political, geopolitical issues in the world, and also reminding me of Patagonia's Footprint Chronicles, which tries to track the effects of the company's production processes. I'll turn up the sound here. And so you're seeing this piece here with the very symbolic and sonically interesting metronome. And maybe we'll look one more time at the pharmaceutical pens, because I can never get enough of those. I guess for me in the museum, they were very powerful, and you could get some good views of the outside as well. And then there's the ecological section of the museum. I wanted to mention to you that when you think about a museum like this one, there's a fine line that certainly is drawn with the guest. I mean, you think about if you're developing, say, meta context in a museum, the issue is, what is the guest going to get or not get, depending on his or her knowledge. Irony, the same thing, as well as, if you want to be more didactic or allow the guest to discover things for him or her own self. And then whenever you're winking at a guest, the question is always, is the guest going to get it? So a lot of this boils down to that issue on the bottom right, the guest's pre-knowledge. How much they know about something. Not that they have to be critical theorists or cultural Marxists to appreciate the museum, but it maybe does make a difference in terms of their ability to perceive and understand some of the things going on that are very complex and I think pretty highbrow here at the Museum of Capitalism. Okay, as we continue the tour, we can take a look here at Christy Chow's Come Run in Me Too. So this particular attraction, I think, breaks some boundaries in terms of some of the previous ones we've seen. Specifically, we're getting into the issue of work and trying to presumably get the guest, the visitor to the museum, to understand the consequences of capitalism in terms of some of the externalities, the indirect costs, the impact on the lives of those who are often anonymous, who produce many of our garments. To the left of this treadmill with the technological screens are a series of pieces of garment, and so it's trying to remind us about what the context and consequences of being a consumer, purchasing capitalistic items, what those consequences are. We often could call this invisible forms of consumption, whereas members of a consumer capitalist society, we don't think about what our buying does in terms of other people out there. Now, this guest here was trying to record the audio, and if you get a chance to experience the piece, there is indeed audio, similar to what you experience in the video game. So I think there's three combinations of forms here, and you're seeing some of my video. One is, of course, the context of work and getting us to think about maquilas and sweatshops. The second is this world of video games, which you see in the technological side of things here. And the third is, you could say, consumer amusements or theme parks per se. It was mentioned in one of the plaques that there was an attempt to convey something, at the level of consumer society, more amusement, connecting that to a serious topic. Now, as you see, I'm struggling a little bit because the treadmill doesn't operate very well, and I can only help but think that maybe that was a metaphor for the piece. The idea is that if you're working really hard, often your efforts don't pay off, right? Because if you're working in a sweatshop or a maquila, you're not paid a living wage for what you're producing. And so it probably does have a metaphorical side of things. It was just hard, though, because I was trying to get for you to see the various images and videos that played on the screen. So it was a little challenging just from an immersive standpoint to get into the context of this. But again, I think that was probably the point of this particular piece of art. Now, I will say the other thing about this is that I think it breaks boundaries a little bit because it does have a technological component. You'll note that much of the exhibitions throughout the Museum of Capitalism don't have this immersive quality to them. So this certainly does offer us that in terms of the technology and the context as well. Okay, continuing our tour, we're seeing here Your Opinion Matters by Dred Scott. Used to know him as Dred Scott Tyler. Actually heard him speak years ago when I was a student at Indiana University in the early 90s, focusing on polling data, and you could actually do a survey, and it really does get into the politics of such surveys, racial politics and election politics, as we know in 2016, 2017 with the election of Donald Trump, which was a shock to many people, in part because I think the polling was so off, to say the least. Now, I wanted to talk about, in this next section, what I call the give back, and we're looking at the people's history of capitalism. The premise of this is it's a booth. You can go in and record your own experiences with capitalism. Actually, at the Mob Museum in Vegas, they have something similar to this, where you could record your understandings or experiences with the mob. So I call this a give back in the Immersive Worlds Handbook, this notion, because it allows the guests to provide something to the exhibition, to the museum. It reminds me a little bit of the piece Smile by Yoko Ono, which I saw years ago in London at the Serpentine Gallery, where you could actually record your smile, and then there was an online exhibit that was part of the actual the show itself. Now, unfortunately, this particular booth was out of order, so it would have been cool to have seen that, but it's a great example, I think, of allowing the guests to give something back or to provide something to the museum and its context. So we can take a look at Jennifer Dalton's piece here called Reckoning. And this is an interesting one. You see you have two vessels, one with surplus, one with debt. And below, the guest has an opportunity to fill out a survey, if you will, and to check the things that apply. And then with each of the vessels and the accompanying surveys, you can also choose to take a pin, a button rather, if you want, which you could wear throughout the visit at the museum. And this actually has the instructions. As you can see here, you have a choice of filling out one of two surveys considering aspects of your life in which you've either given more or taken more. So, on the one hand, this could be seen as perhaps very tongue-in-cheek, but the fact that you have to make a choice, I feel, lends some, success to this particular art piece. It's very symbolic. There's a literalness to it, but there's also, I think, a sense of responsibility or culpability or complicity that the visitor or the guest has to think about. And as you can see, the various buttons that you could wear range from taker to jerk to guilty and freeloader and many others. So this was one of those where you could, fill something out and actually take something with you. Each of the surveys has the same choices at the bottom. You can put your age, male or female, artist, middle class, parent, liberal, conservative, working hard, financially stable at the end of my rope. At the top of each of the two surveys, it's also the same. You have to choose when it comes to community, country, family, friends, work, planet, or other. You've either given more or you've received more. And what was interesting during my visit was the fact that, there were so many of these white surveys still available, right? So I think the implication is that it could be a bit of self-selection. The people that might come to the Museum of Capitalism, I'm not saying this is true, but maybe they've already thought about some of these issues. If they're conditioned to be more reflexive or critical, if you've read Marxist theory, you're probably going to choose, as you can see here, the yellow form. This was the actual last yellow form on the day of my visit. And so it was more common for people to fill out the white form, thus perhaps indicating that they felt a sense of complicity in terms of what they've taken in the world of capitalism, in the world of consumer society. So it's interesting, certainly, to think about this from a conceptual standpoint. I think a very effective piece of art here at the museum. So I'm not going to look at a lot of these pieces in depth, but there's a section in the museum just around the corner from the criminal justice section. And again, I'm giving these labels to the sections. They're not denoted as such in the brochure. It's just my interpretations. But this section here, I believe, focuses on what you could call, critical ecology. Thinking about some of the environmental ills that have been caused by a capitalist consumer society. Things like this one that look like almost science experiments, even getting into the issue of human organs here with these pedestals. So, a lot of curious reflection, I think, opportunities for reflection. Now, one of the interesting things is there was nothing, say, in the museum that offered everyday people opportunities for resisting, say, capitalism or lowering their carbon footprint. So, in my mind, this is why the museum functions more in a conceptual sense and an existential sense. It's not really about teaching practical things to the guest, to the visitor, right? I mean, that's a much different type of a museum. But still, I think there's a lot here for the guests to take in, to consider critically, whether it's the criminal justice side of things, whether it's thinking about work and Wall Street and that economic side of capitalism, going back to the treadmill and the maquiladoras and the sweatshops, all the symbols that you see throughout the museum that gets us to think critically about what's taken place and maybe what's coming. The playful predictiveness, thinking about the future through the past tense that we talked about. I mean, just all in all, there's, I think, so much to take in terms of opportunities for critical reflection. And that's why, for me, this sort of space as a conceptual museum is so key, because there are so few spaces like this in the world, not just in terms of museums, but all immersive spaces that we might consider. Okay, as we close the tour today, we'll take another look here at the library and gift shop. Again, you could say that the library here functions both as its own artistic performance and also offers opportunities for people to do research. And you see some of the books included here. Always an opportunity, I think, when you have books, right, to educate the public, to educate guests, regardless of the context. And in this case, I think education is an important context to consider when you think about capitalism and transforming a capitalist society, if that's your goal. Again, we see the FDIC books here that are burnt, which is the one exhibit that is next to the gift shop and the library, and you see some of the pamphlets available here for people to look at as well. And I guess it's appropriate as we near the end of our tour to exit through the gift shop, so you could, yes, indeed, purchase your own Museum of Capitalism t-shirt if you so desire. Quite a bit of critical information available here, pamphlets, and one very curious book here. Kind of ironic, right, to see a book by Donald Trump, How to Get Rich, Not the Art of the Deal. This one I'm sure is even better. Here at the museum, what a great find. You see other accoutrements you could purchase, knickknacks like you would find in any gift shop, in any museum. There's, of course, this project you talked about earlier of parody that's going on, as well as, I guess, opportunities to partially fund some of the costs of the museum beyond their grant. Other examples here, and in just a second here you'll see more of the pamphlets that you could get, and these are certainly ones that are critical of the criminal justice system, prison reform, embezzlement in organizations. You see many of the opportunities here to purchase some of these. And just in case you're wondering, I purchased one item. Here it is. It was $1. It's the Museum of Capitalism commodities, and specifically it's bottled water. So I spent $1 for this, and I thought I needed a souvenir, and indeed this is what I chose to purchase. So I hope you enjoyed the video feature today here, my tour of the Museum of Capitalism in Oakland, California. I do hope that they extend their opening, extend their opportunities for the guests to really delve inside this interesting museum in Oakland. They are scheduled to close as of the production of this video, August 20th, 2017. But go on the internet, see what's happening. I hope that they will memorialize what they've done here if they do have to close. I do know they have a book coming out, a catalog which you could purchase. I haven't been able to find it yet, but I'm sure it'll be an interesting take on this very intriguing, interesting conceptual museum in Oakland, California. So please do come back for additional video features of the Immersive World's Handbook.